Okay, we're recording. All right, great. This is our third poem out of 4. For those
I
who
brought
are
my face
keeping
back
track at
here
home.
for the important educational distinction of having my beard present.
And there's like multiple images of my face. Hold on. Do you need the extra screen that also shows that? Because I can see us up here. Yeah, perfect. Thanks. It's just a little bit trippy to see yourself in like multiple mirrored images. Okay, cool. So this is Grenville. Gahl, do you want to read it first this time?
Yeah.
Shake it up a bit.
Absolutely. This is going to be a cold read, though, so I'm probably going to do a little bit less fancy than normal. I'm going to sound more like Amay this time. Amay is going to sound more like me. Okay. Grenville. There was no treasure at the bottom of the sea, but they dredged up creatures that would be talked about for years. Hideous forms with no eyes, no fins, helpless and translucent in jellied fetal skins, sucking and gawping against the chill ocean wind. The fishermen crossed themselves and took a hook to the face of the first they hit, an abscess, and the thing burst. The second simply quivered and died. In the house of Sir Richard Grenville, I've heard talk of the last and third. The servants say he preserves it well, and when he sent Charles its likeness in a letter, the king wrote back, "It must come from hell." When I asked Sir Richard himself, he smiled and said, "Well, why don't you come and see?" In that dimly lit room we had kept lepers and lions before. The acrid stench burned in my lungs, and I heard rats running in the walls. He had a Judas Cradle under a sheet, and insisted its twin lay in the bowels of the Vatican, behind a false wall operated by pulleys bearing a portrait of Carloman III. I approached the metal casket in the corner, which only seemed to me to contain a rotting man-o'-war, and our deep fear of the unseen.
Okay, brilliant. I'll read it now. And just before I do, I'm just going to make a comment on like what the value, the pedagogical value of these readings is. I remember being completely mortified hearing an instructor, read out my poems and reading it like kind of in my head, like all wrong, or not the way I had heard it in my head. But there's something very important about seeing and witnessing and experiencing a reader's encounter with your poem or your story, and hearing them kind of read it out loud is one, I think, really obvious way that you can kind of encounter the reading process. And also it's wonderful to hear like every reading is different. Everyone is going to bring up different points of emphasis. The way someone speaks is going to change. And it's a really useful tool for performance. If you ever like do readings of your poems or stories, to hear someone else read it, I think is really useful. Okay, so Grenville. There was no treasure at the bottom of the sea, but they dredged up creatures that would be talked about for years. Hideous forms with no eyes, no fins, helpless and translucent in jellied fetal skins, sucking and gawping against the chill ocean wind. The fishermen crossed themselves and took a hook to the face of the first. They hit an abscess, and the thing burst. The second simply quivered and died. In the house of Sir Richard Grenville, I've heard talk of the last and third. The servants say he preserves it well, and when he sent Charles its likeness in a letter, the king wrote back, "It must come from hell." When I asked Sir Richard himself, he smiled and said, "Well, why don't you come and see?" In that dimly lit room where he had kept lepers and lions before, the acrid stench burned in my lungs, and I heard rats running in the walls. He had a Judas Cradle under a sheet and insisted its twin lay in the bowels of the Vatican, behind a false wall operated by pulleys bearing a portrait of Carloman III. I approached the metal casket in the corner, which only seemed to me to contain a rotting man-of-war and our deep fear of the unseen. Okay, great. That's quite interesting. Very gothic.
Yeah. Very, very, very gothic. Lovecraftian, too, in a nice way.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's explicitly what I wrote about the jellied fetal skins. I was like, ooh, I fucking love gawping. Oh my god. Gawping. Sucking and gawping.
Sucking. Yeah, yeah. It's very, very... I like this... second, third, or first, second, third thing, because
Yeah.
as soon as you introduce the first, we start knowing, okay, there's the first one, that means there's more, and then the second one, and it really creates like a thread that we follow through the poem. And I think the characterization is also amazing.
And also
When
that first, second, third creates the atmosphere of a fairy tale in a way, which is really appropriate for this type of poem, I feel like.
That structure of the threes.
Yeah, 3 kids, use it.
I really like these details too, but I like the characterization when he sent Charles its likeness in a letter. The king wrote back, "It must come from hell." I love that, and I love that that's kind of this nice little moment of free and direct discourse, which is a fictional technique, but in a poem, which is wonderful to me.
Yeah.
And so it's a good moment of kind of seeing overlaps of prose and poetry. But I also love the precision of the Judas Cradle. He insisted its twin lay in the bowels of the Vatican behind a false wall operated by pulleys bearing a portrait of Carloman III. So specific. I love that. And it keeps going. I love that it also keeps going, and we kind of have to follow it all the way through.
And this is a situation where I clearly don't know what a Judas Cradle is, but as you can see in my screen, I am literally looking it up on Wikipedia because I want to know. And that means the poem is successful. I don't always have to know everything that's coming up, but if I want to know, then you've done your job. I'm still not understanding exactly what this is for. It looks like a torture device.
It is a torture device, I believe, yeah. Late medieval.
Okay. I also don't know who Carloman III is. I'm assuming he's some sadistic nobleman.
Maybe.
Okay, sure. I don't think it matters though. I think this is one of those things where again the specificity is powerful. Even if you completely lack the background knowledge, you can still sense it really adds to the atmosphere. Okay, so it's basically the Judas Cradle is you find something pointy and sit on it until you die. If I'm understanding this correctly from the visuals. Yeah, it's a pyramid that you sit on, and then you kind of impale yourself through your butt. Wow, that's rough. Okay, and then let's get into. Do you want to cover more things you like? I think we're pretty straightforward. It's not super long of a poem, so in this case, it's really on the surface what's working. It's great.
I think I'll say one last thing about that. I said it before a little bit about the free and direct discourse, but I think what's interesting about this is it's a very narrative poem. I would say this is the poem that the last poem might look more like prose in a sense of having long lines, but this is the poem that works the most like prose in terms of its mechanics. Like this is the one that I would say is the closest to a story, in terms of just like the characters, the way it kind of moves along, the setting, everything else, the way it sets a scene. And so I think that's very interesting, and I really like that.
And make it highly accessible. Like there is nothing wrong with having a poem where I know everything. I understand everything that happens. That's good. So I'm actually. It's quite nice to have a poem where I don't have any question about the actual plot.
Yes, and it's nice to see all these people too. I love that we go from the fisherman, and I love that the speaker becomes a character halfway through the poem.
Yeah, definitely.
I find that really nice that we have this eye that emerges, and that it's actually like a very consistent eye. For the second half of the poem, we have it as a person who's like going about and seeing things. I think that's very strong.
I also noted this part in my very effusive way, but to be more academic about it, I really do love the line lepers and lions, because on a poetic sense, you have a nice alliteration, but in a narrative sense, you have a really interesting juxtaposition and apposition, where keeping lions is one thing, but lepers, are sick human beings. And so he's giving us this list in the opposite order that we would expect and putting them directly next to each other. One where it's like you're keeping an animal like a scientific curiosity, and another one where you're keeping a literal human being as if they are an animal and a scientific curiosity. And it's so telling, both about the character he's describing, but also the speaker themselves, that that's the order it presents us in, and that it's given in such a short time frame. That he's not building up to this, he's just kind of tossing it off.
And I would say also this is a trick you can use if you're having trouble with a list or a sequence in a poem, is reverse. Always reverse. If you have a rhyme scheme where one rhyme seems really obvious, switch the lines, you know, switch which rhyme seems to come first. Because this, Gahl is right, like lepers and lions is the perfect sequence for that. It's much better than lions and lepers, I think, because it's much weirder. You start with the one that's even weirder. And so always remember you can like rearrange things, and that can often be really productive.
Yeah. Should we get to questions?
Yeah, let's get to questions.
Okay. Do you want to go first or should I?
You can go first if you want to.
Okay. So, I mean, there's kind of, I mean, since this is my first reading, I'm kind of cold into it, and I'm still in my excited mode. I have to calm down a little bit. But there are a couple questions that are popping up here. The first one is a really basic one. It's the only line in the poem that I really have a problem with from a craft standpoint, and it's the acrid stench burned in my lungs. And of course, I want to know, what is the stench? What is he smelling in here? Because there's a couple different hints that he's given here. One is that it could be half decomposed fish parts, right? We have these things that have been dredged up from the abyss of the waters. The second is that we have the lepers, so it could be decomposing humans or dying humans. And third is that we have the lions, which would theoretically imply that they're being fed raw meat of some kind. And that's not even touching on the rats. And if there's something else that he wants us to be smelling to sort of complete the picture, I just want to know what this acrid stench is. Is it blood? Is it gore? Is it humans? Is it animals? Is it something else? You know, so that's just a really basic thing that I do wonder about.
I do acrid stench. Also, that language is so familiar to me.
Yeah, it's a very common phrase, I think, used in Gothic literature. Typically, when I hear it, it's about the smell of blood. But again, we don't know what it is here. I guess the next thing that I'm wondering about, I do like the fact that the Judas Cradle exists. I am wondering about the space that it's taking up in this poem. In the sense that, like, everything else that's mentioned is kind of given maybe a line or a half a line, and then we move on to the next one in sort of this menagerie of horrors. And yet, the Judas Cradle sort of sets itself apart by taking up an entire stanza. And, you know, there's intimations that the other one exists in the Vatican, which is, yes, but why are we expanding the scope all of a sudden to, like, maybe it's vaguely tying into a pope or to a religious figure, but I don't know what it's doing in this particular case for, who is this, the Lord Richard Grenville himself. What does it tell me about him with the cradle? And if we're going to spend that much time on it, who is he using it for? Is this for the lepers? Is this for, like, people that cross him? Is this an instrument of terror and sadism, or is it explicitly something that he's using as the church would have, which would be as an interrogation device? Is he someone who's, like, searching for answers? You know, if we're going to go down that road, I think it's great to have it, but I want it to be justifying the amount of space it's taking up in the poem by giving us a little bit more of its value as characterization, because right now that's not totally clear.
I had the impression that under a sheet, I guess I felt like it was justified by this under a sheet moment, because I got the sense this is a guy who's just a collector of, like, sadistic and otherwise horrifying arcane phenomena. And so I thought, I mean, I think you're right that maybe there's a little more that we could get about how either this one or the one that matches it, right, its twin, is used. I think there's maybe a little more that we could understand about that. I agree, it does take up, like, a lot of space in the poem, so there should be maybe a little more connection. But I do like it, I have to admit.
Yeah, I do like it. I don't think it, by any stretch of the imagination, it should be cut. I'm just wondering if we can tweak it a little bit to, or maybe even add a single line to let us know if he's using it or if it just exists. And this will help us clarify a little bit for the lepers too. Is he, again, collecting them but taking care of them, or is he neglecting them, or is he hurting them? What's his relationship to human life? Because that's the real dividing line for me. between collecting scientific curiosities or animals and collecting human beings. That's where we really, for me at least, there's a line that is important to this poem and that we should, matters to me in terms of how both I and the speaker assess Richard Grenville here. And then there's one really small craft question, the rotting man-o-war. So I like the word. I think it has a lot of melos. It's a lush sounding word. That said, I also know it to more or less be, if I'm not mistaken, a jellyfish. Yeah. So if it is that, why are we using the more arcane form? And this isn't something that necessarily has to be answered in the poem. I think this is just as long as the writer knows. If it's strictly about having it be a little bit more out of sync and because of the sound, that's fine. I do think it is striking to me because it's not something that I would expect the speaker to delineate if he just saw the dead body of a jellyfish to know, oh, that one's a man-o-war or that one's a sea wasp, instead of just saying that one's a jellyfish. There's a degree of marine biology knowledge that I'm kind of huh?
It does create a kind of deflationary effect if you say jellyfish at that moment versus man-o-war. There's an interesting tonal shift. Which I think that's what I was going to say. The questions that I had, one was a little bit about the why of the poem. I feel like I'm about 85% of the way there, but there's another kind of 15% that I want to know somehow this poem telling me what the point is. Because it's so well described, you kind of go along with it and you're yeah, tell me everything. And then you're wait a minute, what's the what?
The speaker himself seems to be let down by it in the end, as if he was expecting something bigger. And then he's oh, I just got a rotting jellyfish. Which is why it's almost surprised that he's using more elegant language than I would have expected if the point of this ending is to be there's nothing that special there.
I think there's still, there's something about this last stanza that I find quite interesting, and that's where all my questions would kind of go, is this moment of epiphany, I think, is really interesting. It really creates a nice twist in the poem, because all of this terror and ominousness has been built up since the very beginning. I mean, even with the fishermen crossing themselves, when they see it, and then when the speaker sees it, it's a very different situation. So I really like that. I guess my only question would be kind of how that then relates back through the poem, how you're kind of building that narrative up.
Okay. Let's transition that into the suggestions then. I think we're on the same page here. I don't really have any problem with anything up until it. I just want to build on the ending.
Yes.
Narratively speaking, we end with him approaching the casket, not even opening it. So I feel there's more to write there. Either he's opened it and seen it, in which case there's still the matter of what does the speaker say to Richard Grenville or not say to him. And then again, the so what question that I think you've alluded to, which is what is the speaker going to decide or realize as a result of this new information? What does it clarify for them now that they have realized that there is no wizard behind the curtain. It's just a sad corpse.
And I think we get almost all the way there. We get this philosophical moment, and our deep fear of the unseen. In other words, this is all just kind of drummed up terror of things we can't see in the ocean, which are really just animals. And everyone's kind of overreacting. I think that's quite strong, but I think we could go there a little more. And this is one situation where, and this is in one of the suggestions that I put in. I think I wrote it in my handout, and it's also in this Writing Down the Bones excerpt. I think writing, quote unquote, past the ending would be a really good exercise to do with this poem.
Yeah.
To kind of continue the narrative as far as you can go. And again, you don't have to keep any of that, but it helps you think about kind of what the structure of the whole is going to be, whether there's anything that you need to add if you kind of keep on going and say, okay, look, I've written this far and this is where it ends now, but I'm going to write 4 more stanzas about what happens after this. I think there's a lot of value to that, and you might find that there's some material that you produce that could be useful and kind of add that back into the poem.
Yeah, and I think that there's an implied connection here between fear and cruelty that is never explicitly stated, but I would like to see explored. So I think like that would be a thing that would be, like Amay said, if it doesn't necessarily lead to this poem, it would still be worthwhile as an artistic exercise, and potentially could lead to changes, you know, somewhere in the poem, maybe not in the ending, but earlier on you might realize you want to have an extra detail here to kind of lay out how we go as human beings from being afraid of or, you know, astounded by like the cosmic horror of the unknown into trapping and killing it. Because right now I'm not yet finding the internal emotional logic that leads us from one place to the other, and I don't know where Richard Grenville fits in. Is he someone who does the capturing and killing, or does he simply purchase the product? And how does he even relate to what he owns? Is this something that he has pride in, or that he is fascinated by, or obsessed by, or, you know, where's that? So,
and again, we don't always have to get that directly in the characterization. I think there's ways you can kind of put that into the environment of the poem that will still answer those questions for us.
sure.
And then I wonder about the title. I think I don't think the title's bad, because I think it's right now it's doing what it needs to do, in that it actually gives us the subject matter of the poem.
Well, I mean, the title is the reason why I said that these things are important. Like, Richard Grenville's characterization is important because the title makes him the focus of the poem.
Exactly.
If the focus is on what he's doing and the speaker is actually the character of interest, then it's the speaker's emotional journey we need to care about. You know, so if we want to change the focus of the poem, we can do so simply by changing the title.
Yeah, I think currently it's working for me better than other titles that I floated in my head that wouldn't work. Like, I think this does come close to what the kind of core subject matter is of the poem, but I also think it's something worth reconsidering and experimenting with for the writer, for sure.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you again, especially to Beatrice. It was delicious.
Yeah, great. I'm really excited by the scripted language here too.
Yeah, and thanks to all the writers that I got to read today. That was awesome.
Okay, are we doing one more? I think we're doing one more.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I didn't realize.
Okay, all right. I'll stop recording in this one, and I think we have a 4th one. I might be wrong. This might be the last one.
Sure.